Scourge had always liked to keep to himself. He liked to eat alone, sleep alone, and especially work alone. It's not like he didn't like people, he just never knew what to say. Silence by yourself is fine, but around others it's awkward and uncomfortable. He tried in the past, group missions often involving other people joking and talking all the time, but he could never get a word in edgewise, and even if it did, it'd often be ignored or kill the conversation outright. How can people so easily come up with the right things to say so quickly? He sighed and watched Killstreak amble towards a fly it had ensnared within its web. No urgency, just deathly finesse. He sometimes wished he could talk to his spiders, but the quiet suited Scourge just fine. "Hey!" The sudden voice startled Scourge, and he spun around to see where it came from. Standing in the doorway was LUR. She was staring at him with piercing blue eyes, sharp teeth jagging out of a wide smile that was plastered across her face, illuminated only by the glow of her antennae dangling in front of it. Scourge hadn't really ever spoken to LUR. They'd made introductions when she joined a year or so ago. She was the first fishwoman to join the Eight Flames to his knowledge. She often dealt with a lot of undersea missions, meaning they very rarely crossed paths. Hello? Scourge said timidly. "Looks like we're working together, partner." Huh? But before Scourge could finish his sentence, LUR had already left the room. "This is a multi-target mission, and that requires me to send more than one operative, and Olaf is a little bit busy right now," Hemlock said flatly, barely looking up from her paperwork. They were sitting in her office now, plants and wildlife dotting the surroundings. Whenever Scourge comes in here, it always feels more like a botanical garden than the lead office of a mercenary organization. LUR was sitting to his left, feet on the table, picking at the dirt beneath her fingernails. But Scourge protested fruitlessly. Who was he kidding? He could never argue back against the boss, and the annoyed glance Hemlock shot his way was enough to shut him up. "Fine by me," LUR said. Scourge looked over at his co-worker to see her open her mouth like a snake unhinging its jaw and dropping an entire haddock into it, swallowing it whole. When she was done, she noticed him staring and gave him a wink, sending shivers down Scourge's spine. Why did it have to be him? Why not Taurus or Malaise? I guess he was number 7 now, and that comes with responsibilities he needed to be prepared for. He needed to be professional, push down his anxieties, and at least try. I look forward to working with you," he managed to say, underneath his breath. "What was that?" LUR responded, eyes peering over to him. All confidence sapped away from Scourge in an instant. Was that too formal? Should he have just stayed quiet instead? Maybe said something like, "That's cool by me too," and played it off like it was no big deal. He noticed the silence grow louder as he was thinking. How much time has passed? He needs to say something. Would it be too awkward to just repeat himself now? Wouldn't it look weird to be thinking this long simply to repeat himself? He started. He was looking at the ground but could feel her eyes drilling into him. "Nothing. I didn't say anything." "Weirdo," LUR remarked, but without malice, just stating a simple fact. Hemlock, not noticing the exchange, continued. The target saw a group of rogue Marines. She opened up a manila envelope and tossed a handful of pictures onto the table. Scourge picked one of them up, thankful to have a distraction. They operate out of the Grand Line. Track them down and, well, you know the rest. "Sounds good to me," LUR said, licking her lips. "Come on, bug boy, this should be fun." She smacked him on the back as she made her way up and out. Yeah, Scourge replied, still not making eye contact. He focused on the picture in his hands. A boy with spiky red hair and a stupid-looking grin looked back up at him. At least the targets looked easy enough to deal with. The ship was rocking side to side, not violently, but enough to cause Scourge some discomfort. The air was cold and crisp, the salty smell of the ocean stinging his nostrils. The waves lapped against the side of the boat, and he could hear the seagulls cawing overhead. He stood on the deck of the ship, watching the sun set into the horizon. LUR was sitting on the railing, humming a tune as she stared out into the sea, legs kicking back and forth. The sky was a blend of red and yellows, the water an oily black. Scourge felt like he should really make some conversation. He wasn't a natural at small talk, but this was a good opportunity to practice. It's nice. What? LUR didn't look at him. She kept her eyes focused on the vast expanse in front of her. The view, it's nice. LUR was silent. Scourge cursed to himself. That wasn't what he wanted to say. He wasn't even sure what he wanted to say. It was just an awkward attempt to make the situation less awkward. Yeah, LUR said, finally turning to face him. It is. LUR jumped down from the railing and walked towards Scourge. He froze as she placed her hand on his shoulder. We'll be landing soon, she said, her voice low and quiet. Make sure you're ready. I'm itching to get to work. She smiled at him and turned to walk away, her tail brushing against his leg as she did so. Scourge felt his heart rate quicken. He rarely ever gets that physically close to people, and LUR was so intense. He could feel the heat rising in his cheeks. He took a deep breath and tried to compose himself. He needed to focus. They had a job to do. It was late when they docked at the island. The harbour was empty save for a few overly determined fishermen working in the dim light of the lanterns dotted across the decking. Sulis Island was a tourist hotspot, and during the day, coloured buildings would tower over bustling streets of visitors. But at night it had this air of calm about it, like a sleeping beast, the softness before the storm. An odd-looking duo greeted them when they arrived, one tall and skinny, the other short and round. They looked like caricatures more than real people to Scourge, but he'd seen plenty of weird people in his time. They introduced themselves as Plaff and Jaffa, but he quickly forgot which one was which. They talked a lot, but they said very little of importance, and it wasn't long until LUR shut them up with a threat of violence. The rest of the journey was in silence, as the peculiar pair led them towards a house a little ways out of the main hub of the town. Plaff, or Jaffa, Scourge didn't know which, knocked on the front door of the house and said in a hushed tone, "Boss, we brought them." The door opened and they were greeted by a tall lady with dark hair. She was dressed smartly in a red suit, a beret in the shape of a mushroom sat atop her head. Her face was hard and focused, like she'd never smiled in her life, and the dark rings under her eyes told Scourge that she probably hadn't been sleeping much either. She glanced down at Plaff and Jaffa. "Thank you. You can go," she ordered. Plaff and Jaffa nodded and quickly retreated without saying a word, probably grateful to still be alive. Scourge turned his attention to the woman, their contractor, he presumed. "Nice to meet you," she said, with no warmness in her voice. "My name is Chantalelle. Come on in." They sat dotted around a plush living room. Scourge was sitting alone on the sofa, whilst LUR had occupied the armchair. Decorated pillows in the shape of various fungi rested next to him. The owner really stuck to a theme, Scourge thought. A large framed picture of a stern-looking marine hung on the wall, his head adorned with a giant mushroom. A relative, maybe? LUR was already shifting uncomfortably in her seat, eventually deciding to squat atop it. Chantarelle gave her a disapproving look, but she chose to ignore it, picking at a scab on her arm. "So you are the assassins I have been sent?" she began. Mercenaries, Scourge corrected under his breath. But either she didn't notice or she didn't care. "Pardon my hesitation, but you don't look quite as strong as I expected."
"You want to test that, sunshine?"
LUR snapped back, a challenging look in her eye, but her smile remained. She enjoyed being tested, it seemed. There was a flash of realization across Chantarelle's face. He sympathized with her a little bit. It's not every day you meet professional killers, and they're never quite how you imagine them. "Right, Chantarelle continued. I am not going to bore you with reasons or motivation. The targets are Marines, therefore I am entirely powerless to do anything against them. This felt like my only option."
"I love being an only option,"
LUR replied mockingly.
"So, where are they now?"
"I'm not quite sure. The last time I spoke to them, they wanted to find a shipcoater on the island. A man named Rami." Scourge looked up. A shipcoater? This far from Sabaody? Why would they be wanting to find a shipcoater? Before Scourge could complete his thought, LUR, who was clearly already bored by all the talking, jumped up onto her feet.
"Right then. It looks like we have a man to interrogate. Where can we find him?"
Chantarelle paused, taken aback by her sudden movements, and then answered, "All I know is that he frequents a tavern called the Capybara in East Town."
"Great!"
LUR started to make her way to the exit.
"Come on, bug boy. Let's get moving."
Right." Scourge got up and started to follow her, only just now realizing he hadn't contributed to the conversation at all. "Promise me you won't hurt him," Chantarelle said as they left, probably realizing how pointless it was to ask as the words came out of her mouth.
"I'm terrible at keeping promises."
LUR gave her a wicked grin before slamming the door. It was a short walk to the tavern, and they didn't speak the whole way there. The silence was killing Scourge. He wished he had something to say, something clever and funny, something that would make her laugh, but all he could think about was how nervous he was.
"I can hear you thinking,"
LUR said, breaking the silence.
"Relax. We're gonna have fun."
"I'm not sure fun is the word I'd use," Scourge replied.
"That's because you're boring,"
LUR teased.
"Just you wait. Once you get into the action, your instincts will take over."
She smiled at him, her teeth glinting in the moonlight, and Scourge felt his heart skip a beat.
"Besides," she continued, "we're getting paid, and that's all that matters, right?"
"Right." Scourge said, not quite believing his own words. It's not like this is Scourge's first mission he'd taken. He'd done loads over the years, but he'd often preferred to do things quietly, meticulously planning out the details. That way he could be certain that when his target was dead, it was quick and painless. He didn't enjoy taking lives per se, but he did enjoy the satisfaction of a job well done. And he was good at it. At least he thought so. LUR, on the other hand, had a different approach to things. There was something about her that intrigued him. The way that she carried herself with such confidence and bravado. The way she didn't seem to care what anyone else thought of her. It made him a little jealous, if he was being honest. Maybe working with her would help him learn a thing or two. The tavern was a lively place, despite the late hour. A live band was playing in the corner, their music mixing with the sound of laughter and conversation.
Well, this place looks fun,
LUR said, eyeing the crowd.
Why don't we have a drink before we get to work?
I don't think that's a good idea, Scourge replied. But LUR was already making her way to the bar.
Come on, live a little,
she called over her shoulder. Scourge sighed and followed her. He knew better than to argue with her. Behind the bar, much to Scourge's surprise, was a large capybara sitting on a stool. Next to it stood a disheveled-looking man. He didn't say anything. Seemed he was waiting for something to happen. LUR seemed unfazed by this animal bartender.
I love it,
she said, placing an elbow on the table as she continued.
Hello, Mr. Capybara. May we please have a drink?
The capybara snorted in response. He said that will be 600 belly, the man said, seemingly translating the animal noises. LUR eyed Scourge expectantly, and suddenly he realized she expected him to pay. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled wad of cash that Hemlock had given him. He'd been saving up for a while and couldn't remember how much was there, but he was sure it was more than 600 belly. He held the money out, but the man didn't take it. He simply sighed and pointed at the capybara. Please place it in the capybara's mouth. Scourge only just noticed that the animal had its mouth wide open. He glanced at LUR, who was already chuckling to herself.
Hey, you heard the man,
she said. Scourge tentatively placed the money in the capybara's mouth, and the animal gently closed its lips, swallowing it all in one gulp. I didn't know capybaras could do that, Scourge muttered.
There's a lot of things that you don't know, bug boy.
LUR grinned. They're arachnids, Scourge found himself saying.
What?
They're spiders. They're not bugs. LUR eyed him over and Scourge looked away, immediately regretting saying anything. It didn't really matter that much and he knew that she wouldn't care. Worse, it'd probably anger her. The moment was punctuated by the sound of the man pouring the drinks behind her. When he was done, she grabbed them both and handed one to Scourge. He looked up to see her smile hadn't left her face.
Look at you, standing up for yourself, she remarked. I heard you were a doormat.
Scourge didn't quite know what to say, but before he could try to respond, LUR threw her head back and downed her drink in one go. Then she slammed the glass back down on the countertop and let out a satisfied sigh.
Man, that's good.
Scourge sipped his own drink slowly, the burning sensation making his nose scrunch up. He didn't really like alcohol, but he didn't want to seem childish.
Now then,
she said, turning to face the rest of the tavern.
One of these guys either knows rummy or is rummy.
Scourge followed her gaze, looking around the room. Most were just average citizens, having a good time, but there were a few that stood out. He ran his eyes across them. This was something he was good at, something he could focus on, calm himself down. That guy over there, he said, nodding towards an older man sitting alone at the table. He's been staring at us since we came in. He doesn't look like a tourist either.
Good catch,
LUR said, grinning.
Why don't we go say hello, huh?
The man watched them approach. As they got closer, Scourge noticed that he was wearing an eye patch.
Evening, sir,
LUR said, leaning against the table.
Mind if we join you?
The man was silent, but he continued staring at them. Scourge was starting to feel uneasy. I'd rather drink alone, thank you, the man said finally.
Oh, come on,
LUR replied, pulling up a chair and sitting down.
We're not here to cause trouble, we're just looking for someone. And you look like a man who knows people. Can you help us?
The man looked them over. His one eye seemed to be studying them, trying to read them. Well, maybe, he said. Who is it that you're looking for? A shipcoater, Scourge chimed in.
Yeah, rummy. A ring a bell?
LUR added. The man narrowed his eyes. Well, that's me, he responded hesitantly. But I don't coat ships anymore. Sorry to disappoint. LUR leaned over towards him, showing her teeth.
That's not what we're here for.
Rummy's body hit the ground with a thump. Trash and debris cushioned his fall, but the wind was knocked out of his lungs. They were in the alley now. The exchange was entirely lit by the cold light of LUR's antenna. She had somehow convinced him to take their conversation outside. SCOURGE imagined Rummy was regretting it now.
I'm not telling you anything,
Rummy said in between ragged breaths.
I've dealt with scum 10 times worse than you. Oh, trust me,
LUR grinned.
You ain't ever met scum like me.
SCOURGE only now just noticed the metal chain snaking up LUR's arm. She raised her hand in the air ready to strike. He turned his attention to Rummy, however, who was reaching for a rum bottle in his jacket. Without a second to spare, SCOURGE fired out a burst of web from his wrist, shooting across the alley before hitting Rummy's hand and pinning it against his chest. LUR paused for a second and looked over her shoulder back at him.
Neat trick,
she remarked before bringing her hand down, the force of which caused the chain to fly through the air and pierce Rummy in the chest. He stared at them, his one eye filled with fear and hate.
You think you could just beat the answers out of me?
He snarled. LUR chuckled.
Yes,
she said, raising her arm again.
I do.
She grabbed the chain and pulled backwards with enough strength to bring the old man towards her. Safe to say he was not expecting it, as he let out a small yelp before being pulled through the air. LUR reached out and caught him with her other hand before leaning in close.
Trust me, it's not worth it,
she whispered. She opened her mouth to present a row of razor-like teeth, which sparkled in the blue light. SCOURGE watched the scene unfold in cold silence. This felt extreme, but sometimes you had to be extreme to get results, and to be honest, he was grateful to not have to go through the effort himself. A lot of SCOURGE's life was trying to justify things for himself. He would often talk himself into thinking his targets were bad people, but he knew that wasn't always true. He wasn't doing this for any greater good. He provided a service and he got paid. It was a job like any other, and SCOURGE was certain there were more morally bankrupt jobs out there. At least this was honest. LUR, on the other hand, didn't seem to have any reservations about what she was doing. No thinking on the morality of things. She just seemed to be enjoying the process. And to a certain extent, he respected that. She sank her teeth into the flesh of Rummy's shoulder, and the old man screamed. The sound echoed throughout the alley. SCOURGE winced. It looked painful. He could see the blood trickling down the man's chest.
Now, I'm gonna ask you again,
LUR said, her voice low and dangerous.
Where are the Marines?
Fuck you, Rummy gasped, his breath coming out in ragged bursts. LUR sighed and shook her head.
Ah, well, I was hoping you'd say that,
she said, grinning. And with that, she brought her teeth down again, tearing another chunk out of the man's flesh. Did he have a family? SCOURGE thought. A man that age must have someone in his life. Something to be around for and protect. Everybody has a limit. People think they can stand on their principles till the bitter end, but even the hardest of principles soften when faced with death. He was sure this old man was strong in his time, but looking at him now, blood soaking his jacket, his best years were long past him. Sometimes just surviving until the next day is the most important thing you can do, for the ones you love. SCOURGE saw in his eyes that finally Rummy had come to that realization too.
Oh, okay. Okay,
Rummy cried, his voice trembling with pain.
I'll fucking tell you. I'll tell you what you want to know. Just please.
LUR released her grip, and Rummy fell to the ground, clutching his bloody shoulder.
Well,
she said, licking her lips.
Go on.
Rummy took a deep breath and steadied himself.
We're heading to Gallon Bay,
he said.
I don't know any more than that, I swear.
That's all I needed, LUR said, flashing him a smile.
Thank you for your cooperation.
The words had barely escaped from her lips before she flung her arm out again, the chain a whip-crack blur of steel. It bit deep, slicing into Rummy's chest with a wet, meaty thunk. His breath hitched, a rasping wheeze as his fingers scrabbled at the ragged wound, red blooming across his shirt like spilled wine. But there was no stopping it now, no clever words to wheedle his way free. His legs gave out first, folding like a puppet with its strings cut. Then his eyes went dull, staring up at nothing in particular, like he'd just realized how the world works, too late. SCOURGE stared at the corpse. Part of him felt sick. The old man hadn't deserved this. He'd been through enough already. LUR was grinning, however. She seemed to be enjoying herself.
Come on,
she said, wiping the blood from her mouth.
Let's get moving. We've got a lot of work to do.
SCOURGE didn't say anything. He was still staring at the body. You didn't have to kill him, SCOURGE protested. They were walking towards the docks now, the body still fresh in his mind.
Oh, come on, don't go soft on me now, LUR replied. He might have warned the Marines we were coming.
She was walking at a pace that Scourge had to jog a little to keep up with.
And besides, she continued, you're a trained killer. You can't tell me you're not used to this.
He didn't answer. He had no defense, if he was being honest. LUR was right. He had killed plenty of people. He did know what he was doing. But something about tonight had unsettled him. Maybe it was the way LUR had no hesitation when she tore into the man. Or maybe it was the fact that she seemed to enjoy it. Either way, he didn't want to admit it out loud.
That was a cool move you did back there, she said, changing the subject.
What? Scourge wasn't sure if he heard her correctly.
With your, web things. I didn't know you could do that.
Scourge was taken aback. He'd never gotten a compliment from a co-worker before. He spent years learning how to control his webs, how to shoot them out, how to manipulate their form and consistency. But nobody had ever commented on it, not even Hemlock. LUR, clearly noticing his lack of response, continued.
You're a good shot, and the way you trapped his arm like that, yeah, it was impressive.
Oh, thanks, Scourge said, a smile creeping onto his face. LUR glanced at him and returned the smile.
Hey, don't mention it.
They walked in silence for a bit, but Scourge didn't mind. He let himself enjoy the night air. The cold wind brought with it the smell of salt water. That reminded him of holidays with his parents.
So, Gallon Bay, huh?
LUR said, breaking the silence.
Never thought I'd be heading home so soon.
Home? Scourge responded, just realizing he didn't really know anything about LUR. He hadn't asked her a single thing about herself on this entire mission. Any normal person would have tried to make at least a basic attempt to get to know someone they were working with, but Scourge had been so wrapped up in his own head he'd barely even attempted.
Yeah, big place. Heard the university's pretty good. Never went there myself, she continued.
It's a Fishman Island? Scourge asked, already dreading where this conversation was headed.
Yup, she replied.
Does that mean it's underwater?
You betcha. Why do you think they were talking to a ship coater?
Scourge hadn't actually thought about that. It was painfully obvious now. How are we meant to get there then? He asked. I mean, now that we no longer have a readily available ship coater. LUR didn't seem to respond to his passive-aggressive remark, and Scourge was probably happy she hadn't noticed.
I'll swim, and you can just ride on my back,
she answered, like it was the most normal thing in the world.
Easy.
Scourge wasn't a big fan of water to begin with, but being a devil fruit user meant it was near debilitating for him to be in it. He knew it sometimes came with the job, and luckily his helmet lets him breathe normally for extended periods of time underwater, so he probably wouldn't die, but he would be entrusting his safety and well-being entirely to LUR until they got there. Oh God, it looks like I don't have a choice, he mumbled.
Don't worry about it, bug boy. I won't let you drown,
she teased, winking at him. He didn't even feel like correcting her. They had rolled into Gallon Bay a few hours back, Scourge barely upright after the journey. Still looked like death, slumped and sucking air like a man who's just crawled out of a grave. LUR had done right by him, though, and kept him safe, which was more than he could have asked for. She kept her promise. Her house squatted on the edge of town, some ancient family estate she'd mentioned offhand. No sign of her family, though. The whole place was strange, a bustling city that was built beneath the waves. The buildings stood tall, glass and stone, shimmering in shades of green and blue, all drowned in seawater light. Scourge was thankful she had offered him a room to stay in, even though it was small and cramped. He sat on a thin mattress, staring at the cracked wall, ears full of noises, shouts, laughter, the wail of music that sounded like it'd been dragged across a reef. Not the quiet he'd expected from an undersea city. He thought it'd be calm, peaceful even. He wondered what it'd be like to grow up here. A loud knock cracked against the door, sharp and sudden, snapping him out of his thoughts.
Hey, bug boy, you decent?
Scourge rubbed at his face. Yeah, he said. The door swung open, creaking like it had a grudge, and there was LUR, black shirt, shorts, hair yanked back into a ponytail, tail swishing lazily behind her like she didn't have a care in the world. Her grin was sharp, intense, and far too pleased with itself.
I got you some booze, she said,
holding up a can like it was a trophy.
Should help take the edge off.
He wasn't surprised that LUR assumed alcohol could solve most problems, but honestly he could use a drink after the day he'd had. Thanks, he said, taking the can, cold against his fingers. She flopped down on the floor in front of him, crossing her legs and pulling out a can of her own.
So, bug boy, what's your story?
She asked, pouring herself a drink, the liquid sloshing in the chipped glass like waves in a storm. Scourge shifted on the bed. I don't know, he muttered. Not much to tell. She cocked an eyebrow in response, the corner of her mouth turning up.
Come on, everybody's got something. You didn't crawl out of the dirt fully formed, did you?
He hesitated, turning the thought over in his head. Was there something worth telling? His life was a string of quiet routines, tending to his spiders, tinkering with his gear, scraping by between jobs. A blank, threadbare existence. Well, he ventured, voice low. I like books.
Books?
LUR repeated, her tone amused as she took a slow sip of her drink.
No way!
The sarcasm hit its mark, but he ignored it. He didn't figure LUR spent much time with anything that couldn't bleed or bite back. Well, what about you then? He asked, turning the attention away from himself. She looked up at him, and for once her smile wasn't cocky. It wasn't dripping with that constant edge of danger she carried around like a second skin. No, this one was soft, genuine even. It caught him off guard, like he'd stumbled upon something he wasn't meant to see.
Not much to tell,
she said, shrugging as if her life was just as dull. Oh, come on, Scourge pressed, mirroring her smile without quite meaning to. There's got to be something. She tilted her head, considering.
Well, I'm pretty good at eating stuff,
she said finally, her voice flat and matter-of-fact. That's it? He asked, one brow lifting.
That's it,
she confirmed, without a hint of shame. They lapsed into silence, the kind that wasn't awkward, just heavy with unspoken things. He sipped his drink, she did the same, and the room settled back into its quiet rhythm. I've got a pet tarantula, Scourge said, the words dripping into the quiet like stones into a still pond. LUR's eyes narrowed.
A pet? That's what it is?
Yeah, he said, a touch defensive. His name's Killstreak. She blinked, then let out a short, sharp laugh.
Killstreak? That's what you went with?
It's a good name, he said, straightening up a little. It fits him.
For a pet,
she said, grinning.
That's a dumb name.
No, he shot back, leaning forwards. It's a cool name, and he's a cool spider. She tilted her head, still wearing that annoyingly warm smile. Then she laughed again, a quick, genuine sound that didn't feel like it had teeth behind it for once.
Fair enough,
she said, waving a hand in surrender. After that, the conversation came easier, words tumbling out like a river breaking a dam. LUR had stories, plenty of them. She painted wild pictures of the places she'd been, the fights she'd won, the people she'd crossed. Scourge didn't have much to add, not really. His life was a quieter one, but he didn't mind. Listening to her was enough, and she didn't seem to care about the awkward silences that popped up when he couldn't think of anything to say. The drinks kept flowing, loosening the edges of the room, and Scourge found himself relaxing in a way that he hadn't in years. LUR was sharp-tongued and cocky, sure, but there was something about her, a spark, a warmth beneath all that swagger, that made him feel comfortable. Like he didn't have to try so hard to hold himself together. She didn't mock him when he stumbled over his words. She didn't roll her eyes when he said something clumsy. Maybe she was just good at hiding her annoyance, but for once, he let himself believe that maybe she was actually enjoying his company too.
So,
she said, pouring another splash of liquor into her glass, steady-handed despite the buzz creeping in.
Why'd you end up a mercenary?
Scourge stared down into his drink, the liquid swirling in the faint light. I don't know, he started, then paused. My dad, he said finally. He was a mercenary. Guess I just wanted to be like him. She raised her eyebrows, taking a slow sip.
That's, sweet,
she said, her tone more genuine than mocking.
Didn't know you had a family.
I don't, he replied, shrugging like it didn't matter. Not anymore, anyway. The air between them shifted, growing heavier. He immediately regretted saying it. People didn't like hearing about dead parents, always made the conversation awkward, left them scrambling for some polite way to move on. He braced himself, expecting the usual half-hearted platitudes. But LUR didn't speak right away. She just frowned into her drink, her tail flicking against the floor in slow, restless movements. Then, so softly he almost missed it, she said, I know how that feels. He looked up, unsure if he'd heard right. What did you say? She glanced at him, her face unusually still.
My old man's gone too, she said.
I'm sorry, he said quickly, the words tumbling out clumsily. I'm sure he was a great man. Thanks, she murmured, her voice quiet. Her cocky grin was nowhere to be seen, her gaze fixed on the bed.
Sometimes, I feel like I let him down.
Scourge didn't say anything, just watched as her usual bravado slipped away like smoke on the wind.
He wanted me to go to university, get a degree, make something of myself. Work for him in Parliament, respectable stuff.
Her lips twisted into a bitter smile.
Instead, I spent my teenage years drinking and picking fights.
He tilted his head, curious now despite himself. Your dad was a politician?
Prime Minister,
she said, a flicker of pride creeping into her voice, even as her fingers fiddled nervously with her cup.
Biggest deal in the country, at the time. I thought his whole world was boring, stupid. Thought I'd never need it.
She laughed, but there wasn't any humor in it, just a sharp, dry sound that hung in the air.
When he died, I didn't have a clue what to do with myself. Guess I always figured, deep down, he'd pull me out of the mess I'd made, show me the way. But, well, that's not going to happen now.
Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment, she just stared at the floor, quiet and small in a way Scourge hadn't thought possible. So, he said softly, you became a mercenary.
Yeah,
she said, straightening up, though her hand still shook slightly as she gripped the cup.
Fighting's the one thing I'm good at, always have been, and I like it. Makes me feel like I've got some kind of control,
He nodded. He did know. He wasn't sure if it was the alcohol dulling his edges or something deeper settling into him, but for the first time, he thought he understood her. LUR wasn't some untouchable force, a monster to fear or revere. She was just another person, battered and bruised by life and doing her damn best to stay upright. Not so much different from him, really. Without thinking, he reached out and rested a hand on her leg. She flinched, just for a second. But then her shoulders eased, and she looked up, meeting his gaze. I think your dad would be proud, he said, his voice low but steady. You've done a hell of a lot with what you've got, and you're good at what you do. Better than most. For a moment, she just stared at him, her face unreadable in the flickering light. Then she smiled, small but warm.
You don't have to make me feel better, Bug Boy.
They're arachnids, he said, automatically, before immediately regretting it.
I know, she replied,
a spark of humor returning to her voice.
But Spider Boy doesn't roll off the tongue quite the same.
Her laugh was soft but genuine, and before he knew it, Scourge was grinning too.
She said,
leaning forward slightly, her antennae casting faint cerulean glows across the room.
You're not so bad.
And then she kissed him. Quick, almost cautious, her lips brushing his like she wasn't entirely sure of the move herself. Scourge froze, his brain grinding to a halt. She pulled back, and the space between them felt heavier than ever. Her brow furrowed, her mouth pulling down into a frown.
Shit, I'm sorry,
No. He cut her off, his words tripping over each other as his face went hot. It's okay, I liked it. LUR's grin returned, sharp and dangerous as always, but softer somehow. The light from her antennae caught the edges of her face, throwing her features into a cool glow.
Good,
she said, leaning in again, slower this time, her movements deliberate. And this time, Scourge didn't freeze.